All right. Hello, everyone. It is noon here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I am. So, time to get started. My name's Nicole Bryant. I am the managing director of the program on negotiation at Harvard Law School, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of our guests today, joining us from all over the world to the first program on negotiation event of this new academic year. And so I wanted to come on and say a very special thanks and welcome to everyone for being here. It is a pleasure always putting on these online events. I was checking the numbers, and last year we had over 6,000 attendees at various events through the course of our year, actually closer to 6,500. So, to be precise. So we are very proud to be able to put on all of these moments for our community to engage in knowledge and learning together. I will ask for the slides to come back up so I can talk very briefly about some things that we have um, in store over the rest of the semester. We are in the process of setting up all of our events, and I will announce the following two. So, colleagues from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government will be on next week to talk about their work training climate negotiators from a negotiations perspective. And then we will have the pleasure of having Harvard Business School professor Catherine Kaufman joining us on October 14th. And many other sessions are in the works of being planned. We're working on scheduling dates, getting descriptions up on the website. So please stay tuned for all that we have coming up. I'll take this moment to thank the incredible PON staff who always does so much to put on all of these moments. There's a lot of work behind the scenes. Laura San Pietro, Riley Schretzel, Luis Reyes, and Kenneth Russell did all of the grunt and important work behind the scenes today. So I'm very grateful to them as ever. And now, my absolute last task is to introduce the moderator for today's session, and indeed for all of the Herbert C. Kellman seminars that we have the great pleasure of putting on here at PON in collaboration with the Weatherhead Center. So Dr. Donna Hicks is a longtime PON affiliate and an incredible presence in the world of conflict resolution. She leads these seminars, which are named in memory of her mentor, Herbert C. Kellman, and finds wonderful topics and speakers on a variety of engaging subjects. So I will now, without further ado, turn over the microphone to Donna, who will, of course, introduce today's speaker and topic. Thank you, Donna.
Yes, Nicole, thank you. That was lovely. I'm also happy to welcome you, and we know we have people from all over the world. So we're grateful that you've just taken the time to be with us and to share some insights that David Lesch is going to be sharing with us about Syria. As Nicole pointed out, the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, where I'm located, is co-sponsors this with the program on negotiation. We've been doing it for years, and it's just a match made in heaven. We've really had a lot of fun putting these seminars together. And I too want to thank the staff. We couldn't do it without them. Absolutely not. And Dr. David Lesch is our speaker for today, and he's going to be talking about his long interest in Syria. And he is, let me just give you a little background about David. He, whoops, hold on. Okay, about David Lesch is the Ewing.
Ewing.
Ewing, how so?
I'm in Texas. It's like J.R. Ewing.
Yeah, it's got to be. Yeah. He distinguished professor of history in the Department of History at Trinity University. He received his PhD in Middle East history from Harvard. He is the author or editor of 18 books and on a variety of Middle East topics, and has had over 140 publications overall. He has advised the White House, the State Department, and other governmental entities in the last 5 U.S. presidential administrations. He has consistently met with and advised high-level officials in Europe, the Middle East, and the United Nations on diplomatic issues. He's appeared frequently on national and international television and radio news programs, and he is in over 15 documentaries. He's also on the board of a number of organizations dealing with the Middle East, international affairs, or local politics and business. Dr. Lesch met with former Syrian President Bashar al-Assad on a regular basis between 2004 and 2009, in part as an attempt to develop U.S.-Syrian relations. In addition, he's left the number one, I love this part. In addition, he was the number one draft pick of the Los Angeles Dodgers in the 1980 baseball draft as a pitcher and played in the minor leagues before a rotator cuff injury ended his career. Well, I'm sorry about that, David, but good for us in the world that you decided to do this work. And a biography that has been written about David's life by the accomplished biographer Catherine Nixon Cook, entitled Dodgers to Damascus, David Lesch's Journey from Baseball to the Middle East. And it was just released by Trinity University Press a couple months ago. So take a look at that. And David, without taking up any more of your time, please, we are so happy to have you.
Well, thank you so much, Donna. Thank you, Nicole, and your team for welcoming here. I mean, I feel like I'm part of the program on negotiation because, as some of you know, and Donna, as you well know, I've worked with Bill Urey, for, I don't know, what is it, almost 20 years now on a variety of projects. Some of which involve Syria. Josh Weiss, I know, a friend of the program on negotiation, I've worked with on the Abraham Path Initiative for years. So it's a pleasure to be here. And Donna, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. And Donna is a great friend and colleague, and whose work I've admired and stolen from for for a number of years now. And we're actually kind of working on re-energizing something we've been on in the past. We've been working on in the past in Syria. So I look forward to continuing to work with Donna. So I'm going to speak a little bit about Syria and a little bit about Assad, and then the transition, and perhaps more, especially probably in the Q&A, on the situation currently in Syria with the new government and the new president, Ahmed al-Sharaa. So many years ago, in the first part of the Syrian civil war, in
David,
2000,
excuse me, I forgot to say one thing to our participants. If you have a question or a comment you would like to make, please put it in the Q&A function, and I will give David the questions to answer. But that's not until later. But please put them in the Q&A function. Thank you. Sorry, David.
Oh, no worries, no worries. Good interruption. Early in the Civil War in 2012, I developed, along with Bill Urey, a conflict resolution initiative. And a small group of us, about 4 of us, we went to southern Turkey and Gaziantep, and even into northern Syria to meet with a variety of opposition groups. And during a jam-packed, almost 24-hour a day, 3 or 4 days, we met with a couple of dozen, or actually few dozen, Syrian opposition members, and many of them were militia leaders. And they were so happy to meet with us because we were the first group from the West to actually talk to those who were living and dying and fighting in Syria. Not so much the Syrian exiled opposition, many of whom had not been in Syria for quite some time. And boy, was there a big split between those 2 groups, as often is the case in these sorts of situations. And I'm reminded of one particular gentleman, a militia leader, who he and his friend, it was so interesting. He was a communist atheist, and his lifelong friend was a Salafist, conservative Sunni Muslim. And they drove up all the way from Deir ez-Zor in southeastern Syria, driving through government held or what they considered to be enemy territory to get to us in Gaziantep because they heard, word got around, typically Syrian word gets around, hey, there's some Americans up there that are talking to us and actually, more importantly, listening to us. We even had one militia leader give us a list of weapons if we could provide them. So there was a little bit of misinterpretation, perhaps, of why we were there at times. I asked him, we had a set of questions that we asked everybody, but I went a little bit off script with this one gentleman, and he was one of the last ones to meet with us. And I asked him, why are you doing this? Why are you, dealing with this tremendous deprivation, threats, surrounded by death, family members having been killed? Why are you doing this? And what he said was one of the most profound things I've ever heard. And in fact, Bill Urey actually wrote about it, how it affected him in his recent book called Possible. And he said, I'm doing it because I've heard my voice for the first time. And I know a lot of people on this webinar gets what he was talking to. What he was talking about. It means that he and his comrades were making decisions about the disposition of their daily lives on their own in their municipality. He didn't have to whisper for fear of being overheard. He didn't have to worry about informants around him. So it was this freedom, a newfound freedom, that was so worth it to him and his comrades and many others, despite the deprivation and destruction surrounding him. And in the country as a whole during the Syrian civil war, many people, even in loyalist areas, loyalist to the Assad government, they were empowered by the absence of the state, because the state was really nowhere other than in a couple of the major cities, and most especially in Damascus. So this is something that Assad never got or never really understood, is the empowerment of the Syrian people during the civil war. And he never listened to their voices. It's something Ahmed al-Sharaa has to be mindful of as well, is listening to these voices, because they're still there, they're still empowered, and maybe even more so in the after the transition. And but Assad was never, and certainly his supporters were never really interested, I think, in hearing their voices. They were unfortunately more interested in punishing them and in securing their positions as the civil war kind of wound down. And he couldn't go back to business as usual. It was just impossible. And he didn't realize the clientelist, the meticulous, or the patronage network that he and his father, Hafiz al-Assad, had meticulously built up over the decades was smashed, and didn't really try to recreate another one, a new model, and just kind of try to, again, stay business as usual. And Assad, Bashar al-Assad, as I found, and again, as Donna mentioned, I got to know him very well. I met with him well over 15 times between 2004 and 2009. But the Syrian government, under father and son, generally believed they had much more leverage than they actually had. And they always tried to, not always, but frequently tried to punch above their weight class. And they always thought that countries like the United States thought they were much more important to them than they actually were. And so sometimes they were just asking for much more than they could possibly ever get. Sometimes that worked, oftentimes it did not. And I've been in the middle of some of these things and could see it up close and personal. And he also, Bashar al-Assad, he developed a sense of triumphalism over the years because he survived a number of things. He survived the assassination of former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri in February 2005, when certainly at first the international community led by the United States blamed Syria for the assassination, which later was found to be responsible, that Hezbollah was responsible for it, maybe some Syrian involvement as well. We don't know for sure. But certainly Syria was blamed for it in the beginning and had to withdraw from Lebanon. And I remember meeting with a number of Syrian exile, Syrians in exile, Syrian exiled opposition, and they were popping the champagne bottles because they thought his days were numbered, but he survived and actually used it quite cunningly as a way to secure his position. In 2015, the summer of 2015, it was just after the Syrian opposition, for once, actually put together something close to a unified command, and their external patrons who had different agendas actually, coalesced to support this unified opposition, and that's when they took Idlib in the northwest, from which, of course, Harakat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, and Ahmed al-Shara emerged some years later. ISIS was rising and took Palmyra in the central east part of Syria, and people again were counting the days for the Assad government. But the Russians came in, as many of you know, and September 30th, they came in masse and force, and basically, they became the Syrian Air Force, and the tide of the war turned dramatically. And so he survived that. And, I think, he kind of got this impression of some of the financial institutions, as in the 2008 financial crisis, they were too big to fail or too big to be allowed to fail. And I think he kind of, internalized that attitude, particularly when he started to be rehabilitated in the Arab world. A number of Arab countries, particularly Gulf countries, trying to outmaneuver Iran and Turkey as well, were establishing diplomatic relations with Damascus, and then in 2023, the Arab League readmitted Damascus under Assad. Of course, they had been kicked out early in the civil war, and so he thought, obviously, that he had survived. And I think he really became quite complacent about this. And again, business as usual. He was being rehabilitated, but all along, without making the necessary. And I know I work closely with Gayer Pedersen, the special envoy to Syria. In fact, I worked with all the special envoys to Syria since the civil war began. And Gayer Pedersen, I've known him for quite a long time, Norwegian diplomat who just announced that he's stepping down. But, I know he has been working long and hard and trying to get the opposition to coalesce and come up with a position toward a political settlement, maybe a new constitution that could be agreed upon with the Syrian government. The Syrian government wasn't at all interested in that because why should they feel they won the war? Why should they give up power with the losers? And by 2017, this is when I think Bashar made a critical mistake. I wrote an opinion piece, I think, earlier after he fell, kind of a requiem for him, saying that Assad waited too long. And he did wait too long because he always thought he had time on his side and things would come around, that circumstances would change that would allow him to be integrated. After he was isolated following the Hariri assassination and the administration of George W. Bush after the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the accusations that Syria was allowing jihadists into Iraq, and they were, relations deteriorated. And that's when I became something of an unofficial liaison between Damascus and Washington when relations deteriorated. And yet, toward the end of the Bush administration, Syria was invited to participate in Annapolis talks in Annapolis, Maryland, to talk about progress toward an overall Arab-Israeli peace. So, another occasion where he came in from out of the cold and survived. And I think he had that attitude. And but 2017, 18, 19, whenever, he could have, and his government could have, come to an agreement with the opposition when they had leverage. And the opposition, I think, would have been happy to do so in certain circumstances. But the Assad government wasn't willing to give up any power. Again, they were more interested in punishment and staying in power and trying to recreate things the way they were. Now it's a little bit more nuanced than that, and some of their maneuverability may have been restricted, but there was, some moments where he could have done that, but he waited too long. And unfortunately, the country, continued to break down, continued to deteriorate. It became a car without an engine toward the end of Assad's time in power in 2023 and certainly toward the end of 2024, so that when an invigorated opposition emerging out of Idlib province led by HTS uh, launched a uh, launched a a response to what had been government bombing of Idlib and so forth. In fact, their operation was called Operation Deter Aggression. It wasn't Operation Take Damascus. It was mostly just to improve their strategic position outside of Aleppo. And lo and behold, when they started going, they kept going and kept going, and the Assad forces just crumbled. And the bottom line is that they were, the Assad military terribly underfed, even under-supported, very ill-trained. Very few units were militarily capable by that time. They just crumbled, and they weren't willing to fight for this Syrian government. In fact, most of the people were not willing to fight for a broken down car without an engine and with only room in the car for a few people. And so that's why I think the Syrian government under Bashar al-Assad, the military forces, crumbled just so quickly. It was much weaker than anyone thought. It was weaker than I thought. I think it certainly surprised everybody. Not that essentially that it fell, but that it fell so quickly. It certainly surprised HTS, and they just kept going and going until they reached and took over Damascus in December 2024. So now we have the new government in power, and what challenges it has experienced and still awaits them. It's a very, very, very difficult situation. There have been some good things that have happened, some positive things, but it's a long, long road ahead, a perilous journey. I mean, in essence, they're trying to recreate the state. They're trying to recreate or even create a national identity. And this is tough to do when the country is in such a dilapidated condition, where 90% of the population is living under the poverty line, where the country is tremendously fractured after almost 15 years of civil war. It's incredibly militarized, and there are leaders of militias, there are drug warlords, there are rapacious warlords, not even involved in drugs, or have been long involved in arms smuggling, that really aren't under the control of the government and are very, very independent. And in addition to all of these challenges, not just the economic challenges, again, after the destruction of 15 years of civil war, which conservative estimates say that you need about $400 or $500 billion with a B just to get it back to where it was before the Civil War. You have the withering sanctions from the international community led by the United States that, of course, under President Trump, some have been lifted. But it's one thing lifting them; it's another thing where actual help can get in, economic and reconstruction help can actually get into Syria and get Syria to a point where it can actually make use of those funds institutionally, structurally. It's a long process. So just waving a hand and waving sanctions, it's a good thing for the current Syrian government. It's something they desperately needed, but it's going to take a long time to manifest itself in the country. And also you have to understand that I think that many people on this call do, that when the state breaks down, people retreat into their sectarian fortresses, religious, ethnic, in order for protection or whatever reasons. And that certainly happened in Syria. And it became something of a sectarian conflict, certainly a Sunni-dominated opposition, much more Salafist jihadists as time went on. And of course, as many of you know, the Assad regime from minority Alawites, who also had a on-again, off-again relationship with Druze and sometimes with the Kurds, certainly certainly protected and welcomed Christian Syrians. And for 15 years, or for the majority of the Civil War, you have a generation of fighters who've been indoctrinated with the idea that those who oppose them are heathen filth and pond scum that should not be allowed to live. I remember talking to one in this initiative I spoke about earlier in 2012, which we continued in various forms through 2016-17. Spoke with hundreds of opposition leaders, civil society leaders, as well as military fighters. And talking to this one guy in 2012, and one of the things that we communicated with him that the West was worried about, or that the United States was worried about, is what's going to happen to the minorities if you guys win the Sunni dominated opposition. Are there going to be problems with the minority groups, particularly Christians and Druze and others? And of course, that's still a problem, very much a problem today under the new government. And this guy said, so what, like, for instance, we asked him, what do you think about the Alawites? And he said quite bluntly, of course, we're going to kill them all. Of course we are. And he was, a Salafist. He wasn't a member of the Nusra Front, the Al-Qaeda representative that was formed by Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, otherwise known as Ahmed al-Sharaa today. He wasn't a member of ISIS. We were not allowed, obviously, to talk to groups that were on the terrorism list, but he was a Salafist. And, he told us that he hated confronting all Alawite units of the Syrian government. And of course, we asked why, and he said, because they know we're going to kill them all, and so they're going to fight for the death. They won't surrender. Whereas some of the more Sunni-dominated units in the Syrian army might surrender more quickly. And then you had one guy, tremendously impressive individual, who was one of the leaders of one of the larger militias at the time in 2012, late 2012. We met him in Gaziantep, and he was he was a pediatrician. He loved opera and loved Spanish literature, and he was compelled to be in this position. And he met with us, and I think he apologized because he still had blood on his outfit or on his clothes, and he apologized for that. And later on, we found out why, because we asked him kind of the similar question: how about the minorities if you guys win and come to power? And his answer to us was very dramatic, because he said, well, the blood that's on me is because I just executed personally a Sunni Muslim member of the Syrian government, of the Syrian army. And what he was telling us is that it doesn't matter whether they're Sunni or Alawite or Druze, they're the opposition. So the other side of the coin is that it wouldn't matter if we're in power and would be somewhat inclusive. Now, he was not a Salafist, certainly not a jihadist, but very interesting response to our question. And so that's something that has to be overcome, this utter hatred and mistrust that people have been indoctrinated with, a whole generation of fighters. And how do we get past that? And Ahmed Sharaa, transitioning to this new government, Ahmed Sharaa really doesn't have much to work with right now. There's an institutional vacuum. Many of the ministries don't have a skilled workforce, because those that were there, some stayed, most that were there have left or are no longer in the government because they're considered untrustworthy. Many of these ministries have already become fiefdoms of allies of Ahmed Sharaa and his HTS support. You have a lack or a vacuum of ideology, other than a Salafist jihadist ideology, which they're trying to play down, obviously, and for reasons to make sure that they look good to the international community and can therefore get the sanctions lifted. And there's always the question, do they really believe in this? Are they really playing it down just because they really believe in a more inclusive Syrian society moving forward, or are they just hiding it for the time being? That's a question that really hasn't been answered, at least in my mind. We hope it's answered in the right way, and that they really want a more inclusive society and are moving that direction. They're certainly saying the right things and doing some of the right things in that regard. So there really isn't, much of a state to speak of at this time, and there's really no command and control center or command and control structure. There's really no national military to speak of. Again, you have the Syrian Democratic Forces, mostly Kurdish, supported by the US in the Northeast, that until now have refused to integrate into the Syrian military, and those discussions are ongoing. You have Druze in the South that basically have their own militias and not integrated into the Syrian army. Of course, there were the disturbances and high level of violence and killings that occurred in July, which raises some questions. And of course, the what happened in the Alawite region, the northwest area, back in March, that led to a great deal of death. And again, raising questions about the ability of Ahmed al-Sharaa to really be a leader of all Syrians, and not just the 65% majority Sunni Arab Muslim in the country. So lots of questions like this. And then you have, what I call the spoilers. I just learned from a Syrian source that one prominent Syrian from the past, a cousin of Bashar al-Assad, Rami al-Makhlouf, who actually fell out with Bashar during the Syrian civil war, but was widely considered to be the richest man in Syria for some time, and his family, and he was called the financier, so to speak, of the Assad government. And I've learned, and I haven't confirmed it, but learned that he is and some of his supporters are trying to finance an Alawite uprising in the Northwest, and maybe with the hopes, they hope, of creating an independent statelet. Now, the Syrian government, Ahmed Sharaa, I think, has done a pretty good job of following the violence in the Alawite areas in March to reconcile with Alawite groups, Alawite leaders, become more inclusive. A long way to go, especially if there are these forces pushing in the other direction. And then you have the Druze in the South that I mentioned earlier, who basically kind of think of themselves as separate. They think themselves as actually, part of the founding of the Syrian state based on their opposition to the French mandate and the Druze revolt of 1925. So they think they have, and maybe they do, a disproportionate voice in Syrian history and thus in the future of Syria. And of course, they are being, or at least they offer a protection from the Israelis, and there's the Syrian-Israeli security agreement being negotiated now that may demilitarize the zone, or in addition to a no-fly zone. And even the Alawites have approached the Israelis for protection, which is quite ironic. Alawites have approached various Christian groups in the West, because certainly there were some Christian right-wing groups and leaders who had a good relationship with President Bashar al-Assad, met with him even during the civil war, and earlier when he was ostracized by other parts of the American system and other parts of the global community because he protected Christians. And it's something the Assad regime certainly advertised in order to create more coalitions in the United States and elsewhere in Europe. So lots of things going on. And with all of this, I think that Ahmed Sharaa, he has been on a charm offensive internationally. He's done quite well in reconciling with a number of countries and establishing productive relations, mostly so that they can get reconstruction money and investment in the country, the waiving of sanctions and so forth. But a number of people I've talked to, a number of people in Syria I've talked to, that say that he may well have more external legitimacy than internal legitimacy at this point. Certainly, I think the Israelis, and when I say the Israeli government and military have some questions about him. I think they believe that his pragmatism that he has showed is tactical, and that at some point he will return to his jihadist roots. And so the Israelis are very, very cautious about this. And of course, the Israelis, as they are in Lebanon and Gaza and elsewhere, are operating under the bunker mentality of the post October 7, 2023 Hamas invasion. And they're all about creating these buffer zones all around them to make sure that nothing like that happens again and that the enemy is far away and weakened. And plus, they are able to do that now because the enemy has been weakened considerably, including Iran and its allies, such as Hezbollah in Lebanon and in particular in Syria. So these are issues that the current government has to be concerned about. They seem to be on their way toward establishing a majoritarian sectarian rule in which the disposition and rights of minority groups may be in question. That still needs to play itself out. It still needs to be dealt with, and I'll talk a little bit about one of the ways to do that. And I think in recent talks I've given on Syria, I often use the word conundrum because Ahmed al-Sharaa and his supporters do have a conundrum. They have to portray themselves, whether they feel that way, really like that way or not, as moderate, as inclusive, in order to get that, investment and reconstruction money, in order to get the sanctions lifted, and particularly portray that with the United States government and the Trump administration. But on the other hand, his HTS followers, some of these guys are really hardcore jihadists. They are. And these are the guys that help bring him to power. And throughout history, we see this over and over where, the ruling family or something like that, they ride on the coattails of the tribal elements who formed the military and brought them to power, and yet they want to become settled, respected, legitimate leaders. And at some point, they have to turn on these tribal elements that help bring them to power. And I can see something like that happening here. So Ahmed Sharaa has to walk a very delicate line and has to balance these countervailing forces and has to listen. Talk about listen to voices. He has to listen to the guys that brought them to power. And dealing with the Israelis is not very popular with them. And not fighting back against the Israelis when the Israelis were in a freewheeling way and carrying out attacks both through the ground and air in Syria, all over Syria during most of the Syrian civil war, and certainly after Assad fell. So this is something he has to listen to and has to be cognizant of. And I think of looking back in history, I think something similar. You look back at Saudi Arabia, and when the Saudi movement led by, of course, Abdulaziz ibn Abdurrahman Saud, led the Ikhwan, the Wahhabi, of course, very Salafist, somewhat jihadist, maybe movement that helped bring him to power. And at a certain point, Ibn Saud, he wanted to stop. We can't go beyond these borders. If we go beyond these borders into Iraq in the 1920s and 30s, which is a British mandate at the time, we're going to have to take on the British Army. And so eventually he had to build an alternative force and move against the Ikhwan, and violently. And I see that as a possibility and for Syria, and I see it as a choice that Ahmed Sharaa may have to make in order to really solidify his position and go in a direction that hopefully he wants to go in. And I know there are different views of Ahmed Sharaa. I have not met him. Actually, the biography that Donna mentioned was actually delivered to him in New York yesterday. So hopefully he'll have a chance to read that. I've worked with one group, an NGO in Europe that knows Ahmed Sharaa very well, and I've worked with this group for years. And Ahmed Sharaa, even when he was in Idlib, in an attempt to show people that he has moderated his position, he was no longer the Al-Qaeda in Iraq member or supporter of the founder of ISIS and all of that sort of stuff. He brought a number of NGO organizations into Idlib to meet with him and to see for themselves. And one group again, I've worked with a great deal, and I've asked them about Ahmed Shara. They've worked with him and met with him for about 10 years. And, as I kiddingly told him, well, I guess you picked the right horse, because now he's in power, of course. And they insist, after meeting with him, that he is pragmatic, that he isn't the jihadist he used to be. And people can change, obviously, as they grow older and circumstances change, that he's more an opportunist rather than, an ideologically committed jihadist. But again, the jury is still out, and certainly some groups and certainly a country like Israel is going to err on the side of caution in that regard till they see more evidence to the contrary, I guess. One thing that, and how are we doing on time? Oh, I'm right at the edge here. One thing that hopefully will allow us to move forward, it's something that I've been interested in, and that's the concept of dignity and bringing dignity into Syria, dignity, that basic and universal value. And I've always been interested in Syria since the beginning of the civil war, because as some of you may recall, the Syrian opposition, they used to on Fridays, which is usually the day people go to their communal mosque, and it's a day off. They would call for opposition groups to march, and they would give these Fridays particular names and titles that resonated with the population. Well, the very first one, I think it was March 18th, sometime in March in 2011, was called the Day of Dignity. The Friday of Dignity, they called it. And dignity is very important to Syrians, maybe because of the absence of it, at least from some people's point of view. And of course, again, as many of you know, the whole Syrian civil war emerged out of what was called the Arab Spring, and many of these revolutions that occurred during that time were called the dignity revolutions. People calling for personal dignity and economic dignity and political dignity and sociocultural dignity. And so I became really interested in this, and working with Bill Urey at the time. Well, he said, well, you need to get in touch with my friend Donna Hicks and need to read her work on this, because I was interested in the practical applications of dignity, and I really wasn't familiar with that. It seemed to be more of as most people think, this abstract concept that doesn't have pragmatic or practical applications. So I started reading Donna's work and what she has involved herself in a very practical way in negotiations all over the world, and that there is a practical application for this. And so actually, Bill, Donna, and I, we floated this idea, the Dignity of Syria initiative, in the 2015, 16, 17 period, to try to maybe hold some workshops in Syria. And long story short, the Syrian government at the time just really wasn't interested in it. And again, as I said earlier, they were more interested in punishment and securing their positions in power rather than reconciliation and national healing. And so basically that just went away for a while, and I didn't see an opportunity to really push this again until the Assad government fell in December of last year, and the new government has come in. I started to think about it a little bit more, and I wrote an essay where I mentioned Donna and Bill Urey in the essay that was published in July, and it's called An Office of Dignity in Syria. And I thought it was an intriguing idea, to create, for the Syrian government, Ahmed Shara, to create an Office of Dignity that can oversee many of the practical aspects of dignity across the board. Now, the question is, how do we operationalize this? And that was my question. I approached Geir Pedersen, the special envoy, UN special envoy to Syria, about this idea, and he had the same question. I didn't really have any answers to this until, in fact, I think, Donna, was a reference that you posted, and Donna referenced the Dignity Index that I forget his name, Tim Schreiber, I think, right? He developed this dignity index, I think 2021, and mostly to measure American politicians in a fraught, obviously, and polarized political environment in this country. And, it's basically creating a dignity scorecard. And there's a methodology for doing this. And so I thought, well, can't this be applied to Syria? And then speaking to Bill and speaking particularly to Donna, if we can do this here, and again, a lot of this has to be worked out in terms of really operationalizing it. And do we bring it, more so at the grassroots level, or do we approach the Syrian government, or both? I think, between all of us, we have the connections to do this, but we have to make sure it's carefully well thought out, and we have a carefully thought out plan to bring this in. But we've kind of surveyed a few people that we know in Syria, and they love the idea. Have no idea whether the Syrian government would love the idea. It may be a measure of their intent to be inclusive if they go about this, if they allow something like an Office of Dignity, or whatever they want to call it, an Office of National Reconciliation, something like that. And this is, I think, a way that hopefully we can prevent or minimize and identify abuses, indignities that can be rectified through appropriate government action that focuses more on education and rehabilitation rather than punishment. But a lot of these things need to be worked out. And I'll just end by saying that it's not just the physical healing of the country that needs to take place, maybe even more so the emotional healing of a traumatized population and a divided population, fragmented population. And one of the things that needs to happen for any of this to move forward is the beginnings of trust. And this might have to be at the village to village level, because the mistrust is rampant, the hatred is rampant at a village to village level. And so hopefully we can move forward with this, and certainly welcome any ideas that the audience may have on this. But I do know one thing, that I will keep on trying and working with great people like Donna and Bill Urey and others to keep on trying to bring Syria forward and hopefully put it back together in a way that the people can have at least an opportunity for prosperity and stability. So thanks very much, and open to Q&A. Donna.
Yeah, David, that's remarkable. I was riveted by your conversation and your all the detail of how you've been involved. And I wanted to just tell you that I convened a group of Syrian human rights activists back in 2015, and we were talking about leading with dignity and how Syria is, that was part of their revolution, the whole word like you just described. And the one woman in the group said, all of us here have suffered dignity violations personally, all of it, and the countless. And this one woman said, but you know what? We'll be okay. We'll be able to heal from that. What I'm really worried about is the dignity of Syria.
Mm.
And that moved me, David. That was like, oh, this so much bigger than just the people within Syria. This is a country, as you well know, that is ancient roots and when it was such a prosperous country at one time, as you know. But I just thank you for that, and let's just say to be continued.
Yeah, exactly.
All
Exactly.
right, and we've got some wonderful questions here from our audience, and I thank you all who submitted them. Um, First of all, are there any sanctions on accepting investment capital from Syria? Is that part of the sanctions? Do you know?
Yeah, well, there's no, the problem with the sanctions is that a number of countries have wanted to invest in Syria rebuilding for some time, particularly the Turks, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis, but they don't want to run afoul of the U.S. Treasury. and secondary sanctions and tertiary sanctions. These are wide ranging. I mean, Syria is they were on the original list of states that sponsor terrorism, State Department list in 1979. There was a whole other slew of sanctions, the Syrian Accountability Act in 2003-4, within the environment of the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq. There were more sanctions after the Hadidi assassination, and now, of course, sanctions throughout the Syrian civil war against Syrian institutions, against individuals, and of course the wide-ranging so-called Caesar Act passed by Congress, which has been waived, but Congress, Syria, in fact, some Syrian diplomats have visited Washington recently on their way up to the UNGA in New York, meeting with congresspersons to hopefully try to lift the Caesar Act, which is wide-ranging sanctions. And so it's not so much that the U.S. has specifically said, we're not investing in anything. First of all, the U.S. and Syrian economic interaction is minimal, but it's preventing other groups. And so with the lifting of this, when President Trump met with Ahmed Shara in Riyadh at the behest of Turkish President Erdogan, and particularly Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, he indicated he would want to lift these sanctions and integrate Syria back into the world and the global economy, to the great surprise of many people, I think, in the State Department and Washington and in Congress. It shows the rather obviously the transactional and fickle foreign policy of the Trump administration, and how he listens very closely to people like Erdogan and MBS. So that allowed for some deals to be made. The Emiratis have come in. They want to, have offered to rebuild or improve some ports, particularly in Tartus, build some resorts. The Saudis have come in. There a great deal of infrastructural improvement, from power grids to water sewage. All of these things need to be done. So this is a start. This is a start. There's still a lot of, I think, companies and countries that are a little bit hesitant until they see a little bit more from the current government that would say that my investment will be safe.
Well, someone asked, I don't see it here I don't know where it went, but someone asked, how did it happen that a Al-Qaeda leader has become president? How did that happen?
Well, that's a question asked by lots of people, and it's look at Yasser Arafat and the PLO, and he was an international terrorist, and then became president of the Palestinian territories after Oslo in the 90s. You look at Menachem Begin, the Israeli prime minister, who was and Yitzhak Shamir, who Interpol labeled as international terrorists, and they became prime ministers of Israel. So this is not terribly unusual. And people can change. People can moderate, and as they get older and see the world, and I don't discount that. But there are a lot of questions there. He was able, as opposed to ISIS in Syria. One of the reasons why Ahmed Shara, his nom de guerre, was Abu Muhammad al-Jalani. Jalani means Golan, like the Golan Heights in Arabic, in reference to the territory that Israel occupied in the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, and to signify to potential followers that he was more of a Syrian nationalist. He's going after Syrian nationalist goals, Syrian national goals, rather than global ideology like ISIS and even like Al-Qaeda later. But he started to distance himself, and that's perhaps the pragmatic side. As I said earlier, he started inviting representatives of NGOs to come in and meet with him. And he started to meet with representatives quite quietly from other governments to see for themselves. Now, having said that, the type of role in Idlib under HTS, was quite drastic, at times, or a lot of the time. Uh, but over time, in the last few years, Ahmed Sharaa himself, so I think there's an article in the New York Times today or yesterday that talks about how, he tried to reconcile with Christian elements in Idlib, other minority elements in Idlib, apologize for how they were repressed under HTS in the recent years past. And again, that's the big question. Is this a tactical maneuver or is this real?
Mhm.
And quite frankly, we just don't know. I haven't concluded that. I hope it's real for the future of Syria. The last thing we need is another civil war. But but then you have he has to deal with his, as I said earlier, his core group who will always drag him, and I think in one direction.
So complicated, David. Another question is, what can the neighboring states and the countries around the world do to support a bright future in Syria?
Well, they can continue as long as the sanctions are waived and hopefully overturned or withdrawn. Uh, they can invest in Syria, invest in the people of Syria. One of the sad things about Bashar al-Assad is, they used to call him the Hope, and he at first seemed to be what many people in the West were hoping he would be, but that turned out not to be the case. Certainly, I saw him become much more comfortable with authoritarian power as time went on, and as everyone here knows, the old adage, "absolute power corrupts absolutely," is an old adage because it happens quite a bit. And my old friend Roger Owen, who was at Harvard, he wrote this book. Was it called Arab Presidents for Life or something like that, where he talks about this alternative reality that is created around many of these Arab leaders, where they believe that the well-being of the country is synonymous with their well-being. And it took Syria. And so, bottom line is, in my view, Bashar al-Assad, rather than changing the Syrian system as many people had hoped, had assimilated into the existing system, the existing authoritarian structure. And even under that, they were making some progress, particularly with Turkey and Jordan and some of the surrounding countries as he came in from out of the cold following isolation after the Hariri assassination. I mean, in the December 2010, when he and his wife Asma al-Assad were visiting Paris, and they were feted by the Haute Couture in Paris, and there was a Vogue magazine issue in February, just before the Syrian uprising began, calling Asma al-Assad the Rose of the Desert. So there was so much potential there that was unmet, many misinterpretations and mistakes, and obviously soured the relationship with many of the surrounding countries. Many of
Mhm.
these countries rehabilitated Assad uh, for many reasons, but mostly because of the Captagon drug trade to reduce the inflow of Captagon drugs, and in essence, the Assad government had become what many people called a narco state by that time, by 2017, 18, 19, 20. Uh, and um, uh, and that hasn't really worked. So many of the surrounding countries are interested in stopping that. And so this will take the cooperation of the government, and Ahmed Shah has promised to do that, but his capacity to do that is rather limited right now. But many of these countries, again, have made decisions to invest, and hopefully in a way that that doesn't recreate some of the proxy war, different agendas that occurred in during the civil war itself amongst the opposition that were supported by these different countries that had these different agendas. The Gulf countries, they investing to keep out the Turks, to keep out the Iranians for our own economic advancement. So there has to be some sort of I think, regional cooperation and involvement and coordination in the reconstruction of Syria. And so that, again, all these attempted economic investments don't compete in the way as their armed investment did during the Syrian civil war.
Well, David, I'm afraid we've run out of time. There's many
Sorry.
other questions, and I apologize to our people who are in the audience for not being able to get to all of them. Um, we'll just have to have you back, David, you know? Oh,
Always, always. I'm
yeah.
very
So
happy to.
on behalf of us all at the Weatherhead Center and Program on Negotiation, we thank you so much for taking the time to be with us and sharing your profound insights with all of the people here on this webinar. So thank you, David.
Thank you, Donna, and everybody, Nicole. Thank you very much.